good afternoon or good morning, or maybe it's good evening wherever you're sitting at the moment. The topic that I want to present today is targeting perfect chemical thinning in the spring 2021. That's the spring just coming up, maybe only a month away. And we've talked to a number of our Australian mates to just find out exactly what's going on over in your country. And we gather that it's not too dissimilar to what we're experiencing. We gather that the 2021 returns are well back on 2020, which was a good return year. We think that there's probably blocks on your orchard that won't make a profit this year and are unlikely to next year unless something drastic changes. 20% of my orchard is where I'm making 50% of my profit. I'm describing what I think might be a current predicament here. And generally, we had a good crop last year, but with more moderate weather in most areas of Australia, the trees didn't go into the winter stressed. However, the biggest stress for all of us is that the casual labour supply for particularly thinning, let's just think about thinning in the months of November to January, is extremely uncertain. If you're anything like us in New Zealand, with border closures still the name of the game, those backpackers that have filled such a large number of your positions are going to be in much smaller numbers. The people from the Pacific are in much smaller numbers, and goodness knows what Delta is going to do to the availability of staff and just the ability to move staff. So it's a really uncertain time, again, looking ahead to this year. The worst thing that could happen, probably to most of you, is to have a large hand thinning job. So we must aim again, like we did last year, for this year to be the best chemical thinning we have ever achieved. As Jonathan and Jack mentioned, maybe there's some blocks that are not contributing to the bottom line and are unlikely to do so, where the best chemical thinning would be a chainsaw at their base. And that might sound drastic, but in some cases, that might be the best thing that you could do to preserve your own bottom line. Be prepared to take a higher risk of over thinning on the low margin blocks, and we need to know what they are. Maybe it's another year where it's better to remove the crop from some of those young blocks and focus on growing the canopy this year. But in saying that, we don't want to risk over thinning the money blocks. That's those 20% of blocks that are making 50% of the profit. We certainly don't want to over thin blocks or varieties that are prone to biennial bearing, that are prone to bitter pit, that are prone to internal browning with light crops, varieties such as Kanzi, Jazz, and Envy, because if we do that, we're just going to create an even bigger problem than the labour shortage. And if we do manage to over thin anything with an aggressive chemical thinning strategy, be ready to manage vigour. We do not want to lose control of vigour. And there's quite a few tools that you've got there, ranging from early ethaphon, irrigation deficits early, summer pruning, and regalis. I'd like to encourage you to go back through the chemical thinning notes that have been prepared for future orchards over a number of years, and just refresh your memory on everything going into this, what is one of the most critical parts of the season. I picked up this quote from our mate that passed away just recently, John Wilton, where he said, "A producing apple orchard is a dynamic system. Optimum crop loading strategies cannot be obtained through a recipe approach, but need an integrated approach that recognizes all the various factors that impact on crop and its performance." And here's an illustration, a mind map, if you like, that just tries to illustrate the huge number of variables that come together with what is, could either be a successful chemical thinning result or one that's not. Obviously, you've got the target. That's the tree. Every variety is different. The tree health, depending on the health of the flower bud, will depend on how easy it is to thin. The way it's been pruned, Jack and Jonathan talked about a scenario where a block's got 4 buds per target fruit, which is a lot of bud. That's going to be a more difficult beast to thin than one that's been pruned down to 2 buds per fruit, or even 1.5 in a low vigor situation. And we know how much temperature and weather can have on chemical thinning. The chemistry that we have available to us is all very dependent on weather. Pollination, that's a huge one for every grower, but particularly Australian growers, often under net. Pink lady coming out when there's very little else on the orchard that's out under net. What's the cross-pollination pressure and how hard is that crop going to set? We know that it's a huge number of variables that come in to a successful chemical thinning result. And I'd illustrate it by, I can give the same recommendation to 2 separate growers of the same chemistry, and they will both get totally different results, depending often on the time of the day they've put it on, the water rate they've used, the weather window they've chosen, etc., etc. Just a photo to illustrate things like, you need to walk the block to understand what the flower strength is. Is the block in a biennial bearing swing? Look at the row on the left and the flower load on that, which is very light, compared to the row on the right, which is very heavy. Totally different beasts to thin, and we need to know where our block is situated. The same trees pruned totally different ways. The tree on the left has a much higher bud density than the tree on the right. And not only that, the tree on the right, the pruner has left in a lot of 1-year-old wood, which is totally different to thin than the tree on the left that has a lot of 2- and 3-year-old wood. So knowing what your bud density is, knowing what your wood type is, all extremely important to make a good decision. We look at the chemistry toolbox, and the toolbox, this particular list here won't include all of the tools that you might use, but it's probably the big ones that we would use in Australia. With on my left, the bloom thinners being ATS, Ethifon, and NAA. And then we have bloom combos, which can include combinations of Ethifon and ATS. These are in the same tank, and NAA plus Ethifon in the same tank again, which both, they have a synergistic effect, it would appear, when you put products in the same tank versus applying them as separate applications. You get a more vigorous response. The fruitlet thinners, BA, Metametron now is becoming bigger and bigger, and of course the old stablemate Carbaryl. And then there are various fruitlet combinations of BA plus NAA, BA plus Carbaryl. The John Wilton Super Brew, as we used to call it, is BA plus NAA plus Carbaryl. Quite useful if you're trying to get fruit off young trees. And then Metametron, there are lots of people now playing around with this as a 2-application program rather than a single application. What I wanted to do now is to just use this webinar to make sure that you're right up to date with your thinking, that you understand how these various chemistries work. So I'll just run through them quickly. Ethifon, it's a precursor of natural ethylene. It's typically used in Australia and New Zealand as a bloom thinner. It is heat dependent, requires maximum temperatures above 18. If you've got, like in Tasmania, you've got cool springs where you don't hit those temperatures, won't work. It's very active on the balloon blossom stage. You'll see the photo on the left. If you were to apply Ethifon when the crop was predominantly at that stage, it would preferentially thin out the balloon blossom before it thins out the king bloom. So that would be an ideal time, in my opinion, to apply Ethifon, because the king is the superior bloom. Avoid frosts. It can russet prone varieties, and it can do all sorts of strange things around any stressor on the plant, like a frost, like wet feet. Remember, it's a precursor to natural ethylene. So if the tree is naturally producing a lot of natural ethylene and you put a spike on top, all sorts of interesting things can happen. We know it lowers vigor, which can be quite useful in high vigor trees, but not so useful in young trees where we're trying to fill canopy. It's great for return bloom. And I mentioned there, it can russet. It can russet if applied in poor conditions. NAA is an auxin analog. It's got a wide window of thinning effect from full bloom right through to 15mm fruitlet. It has an increasing effect with temperature, and Jonathan reminded me that sometimes in Australia you can hit temperatures of 30 degrees. So, just be careful of probably all of these temperature effective ones. When you get 30 degrees and above, you're running risk, and you need to either back off, find another window, or reduce rate. It does require heat, a minimum of 18 for 2 to 3 days. It can cause pygmy fruit, this one, so be very careful using it on fruitlets to varieties like Red Delicious, Braeburn, and Fuji. And again, it's often one that's mixed with BA or Carbrel in the fruitlet thinning time to increase their thinning effect. ATS is a bloom thinner, as we all know. It has 2 modes of action, actually. It's a bloom desiccant and a pollen tube growth inhibitor, but it also reduces photosynthesis at a lower rate than metametron, but it still gives the tree a check. So 2 modes of action. If you were to look at that photo again on the left, if you applied ATS when your crop was predominantly in that stage, it would be absolutely the wrong time to do it. So because that would take out the king in preference to the lateral bloom, which is not what you want to do. So take care with timing. You need to walk the block, understand where your target blooms are at, and target the timing of it to take out the weak later bloom. Don't take out your kings. It doesn't require heat, so very useful in cool climates, maybe more useful in climates like Tasmania, certainly in Nelson in New Zealand. It's reactivated with rainfall, so be very wary of that. And if flowering is spread out, multiple applications are required, often used to thin late one-year wood, and can be combined if you really want a super duper primary thinner, can be combined with Ethifon to widen the window of effect, but that makes it aggressive. So just be very careful with your timing. Get on to the fruitlet thinners. BA is a cytokinin analog. It's a secondary thinner, best applied at 8 to 12 millimeters, about the size that picture is on your left. It requires heat also, at least 18 and 2 to 3 days in a row. Also works well when combined with NAA or Carbrel. And the thing to understand with BA is it promotes cell division. So it has the benefit for fruit size and fruit pressure independent of the thinning response. So that's a really good side effect. And it's also very good on promoting return bloom. So very good on those biennial varieties. Carbrel, let's not spend a lot of time on that because we know it's a very broad spectrum insecticide, and it has the negative of not only being toxic to bees, but also being toxic to a lot of beneficial insects. And if we are trying to get more and more into integrated fruit production, which we would encourage every fruit grower to do, this is old chemistry, and you should only be using it where you absolutely have to, and hopefully on a very small proportion of your orchard. The new one, Craig last year called it a game changer. And it's great. It's a great thinner. It has a lot of positive attributes to it. Remember, it's best applied around 10 mils, but has quite a wide window, 8 to 16. The mode of action with this one is to suppress photosynthesis. This is a herbicide, and we're using it at non-toxic rates to the plant, but it reduces the photosynthesis in the plant, reduces the carbohydrate apportionment to the fruitlet, and a lot of them abscise as a result. The thinning effect is directly proportional to the chemical rate per hectare, which can be highly beneficial as you can turn the rate up to get a bigger and bigger effect. But take care, you turn the rate up too high, this can actually overthin this product, probably more so than the other products. It's also very dependent on the climatic conditions, and conditions that will enhance the drop are conditions that put the tree into a carbon deficit. They are conditions of warm nights and cloudy days. If you get conditions like that on top of a metametron, you will have heavy thinning. Can overthin bottoms that are in shade, so be careful with that. Monitoring forecasts is critical to the end result. And it works best with some good interfruit competition, selecting out the weaker, smaller fruitlets. I'm going to talk about just a couple of case studies so that, because what we're really encouraging you to do is before you get into your chemical thinning season, have a plan for each block. Have a plan that you've laid out that you then are ready to tweak as the flower and the weather conditions unfold. I'm going to run through two case studies, one that was actually overthinned. So here's a block. It's actually on my own orchard. I know it well. It's a good block of trees, Pacific Queen. It's got a good margin on it. And we went in last year with a strategy. We were going to be aggressive. And we were aggressive, and this one was overthinned. You'll see in 2021, the yield has dropped to 50 tonnes per hectare. This particular block has done 75 tonnes per hectare in the past, and this was purely due to an aggressive chemical thin. This was the chemical thinning program last year. We put 136 mils of NAA per hectare on just after full bloom. Then we put a metametron on. This is the 70% product at 30 grams, 420 grams per hectare, and that was too aggressive. Notice we made a comment there that was too aggressive, and in hindsight, we should have only used 25 grams on these particular trees. So here's the plan for 2022, all laid out already. The NAA is going to be dropped to 126 mils per hectare, and the metametron, yes, still going to use it, not going to revert back to BA, like the product. Just believe we got the rate wrong last year, back to 25 grams in 1,200 litres of water, delivering 300 grams per hectare. Here's another one, case study number 2. It's a Galaxy block on M9. And if you look at this is a profitability analysis, and Jack and Jonathan referred to it at $7,800 a hectare, which is high. But the biggest loss here is that fruit was too small, and the market value of that fruit just was not high enough. So that result is poor. Whatever we did last year with chemical thinning was not good enough, and the plan this year has got to be to up the game. So here's last year's program. An NAA applied just after full bloom, 126. We're using a 10% product, by the way, which is different in Australia. So make sure you do those conversions of active. And a BA, it's not even a full rate of BA. That's the BA at 10% at 960 mils per hectare, and should have made a big comment, nowhere near aggressive enough. So in 2022, the plan is multiple, actually. In this case, we've decided to increase the NAA rate up to 162, to put an ATS in targeted at the 1-year-old wood into the top half of the tree, and to lift the rate of BA right up to the full rate. So multiple, increasing the NAA, adding the ATS, and also increasing the BA. That's the plan going forward. Okay, the best thinner is your boots. That might sound flippant, but I totally believe it. That the best chemical thinning result you'll get is if you're walking the block regularly. And a lot of clients that I have would do this in conjunction with their frontline advisor. So we find at least weekly, but every second or third day when bloom is tight, observe flower density, flower strength, bee activity, flower timing, top to bottom. Are your tops flowering at a different time to your bottom? Make sure you record the full bloom date. Watch for those stress effects. When you put an NAA on, observe it 3 to 4 days after to see what sort of flagging you've got. Keep an eye out for frost. Keep an eye out for wet feet. They will add stress to the plant. And if you're using metametron or any of these, actually any of them, cloudy days and warm nights will enhance the drop effect. Here's a photo at bloom, right on full bloom. Full bloom's when I describe as when are most of the flowers open, and this block would be right on full bloom on that date. And as you can see, as I walk down the row, it's very consistent. There's no on off. It's a full on bloom. That particular bloom will need good aggressive chemical thinning. When we get into that stage, when the fruitlets are around that 8 mil, and we're looking at this, and if we can look at it from a distance, we'll say, gee, that's a bit scary. All my bloody fruit's dropping off. But look really closely. Look closely at that image because it's very deceptive. And you can see the fruitlets there that are sepals up, they're growing away. And if you look closely, that looks a pretty good result to me. Does that look like it needs another secondary thinner? Absolutely not. So that's where you're walking and observing really important. And this is, you know, the other thing I'd suggest is don't stop walking. Don't put that last, that one first fruitlet thinner on and then stop walking. Have a good look at the 15 mil fruit stage and try and determine of these fruitlets, which ones are going to stay and which ones are going to drop by looking at the fruit size differentiation. And you might look at that and say, oh, gee, there's still, you know, that's still quite a lot. If that's a low margin variety, I might actually consider putting another secondary on, and maybe that might just go into the tops with that sort of fruit density setting up. So in summary, chemical thinning in 2021. First, understand if your hand thinning labor is likely to be in short supply. If the answer is yes, then aim for 2021 to be your best chemical thinning ever achieved. Identify the blocks where aggressive chemical thinning makes commercial sense. Understand the chemical modes of action and debate your chemical strategies with your advisor and do it early, and then be ready to fine-tune that plan as the season unfolds. Walk the blocks regularly and be ready to change the plan. If it ain't broke, don't fix it. That's another one of John's great sayings. Chemical thinning, I would say, is the best time or the most important time to seek that second opinion. There are so many variables come into play. It's not a bad idea. It's not a bad time of the year to get a second opinion. And also, here's a little comment there with hand thinning, is if you can bring some blocks early and some blocks late, you know, metametron allows you to get in and thin those blocks earlier than a BA will. So think about that to try and spread that hand thinning requirement out. I've probably gone a little bit over time, but I hope you've got a lot out of that presentation. Thank you.